The fish and chips shop on the corner was just switching on its evening lights. Golden warmth spilled across the pavement as Mrs. Chen turned the sign from "closed" to "open." The scent of vinegar and battered cod drifted through Maple Street, mixing with the aroma of Sunday roast dinners wafting from kitchen windows. Eleanor Briggs checked her watch in the fading daylight. 6:30 on a September evening. The leaves on the old oak tree outside number 42 were just starting to turn amber. Soon she would need to dig out her winter coat from the upstairs cupboard. She was folding the last of the washing in the front room when it happened. Harold's work shirts, stiff with starch, lay in neat piles on the sofa. Clara's delicate blouses hung over the radiator. Leo's school jumpers, growing too small already, needed sorting. The scream shattered everything. Raw, desperate, animal-like. The kind that makes your blood freeze and your heart stop beating. Monster. How could you do this to her? Eleanor's own voice. But it felt like someone else was shouting. The words came from somewhere deep inside her chest. Somewhere she didn't know existed. Her hands were gripping Harold's collar. His blue taxi driver's shirt, the one she had ironed that morning, was wrinkled in her fists. The fabric felt rough against her palms, coarse and cheap. Clara sat hunched on their front step like a broken doll. Her cream silk blouse, the one Eleanor had bought her for her birthday, hung in tatters. The delicate pearl buttons scattered across the concrete path. Mascara streaked down her cheeks in dark rivers, mixing with tears and something that might have been blood from her split lip. Her hands shook as she tried to pull the torn fabric together, to cover herself, to hold onto some shred of dignity. But the blouse was ruined, beyond repair. Mrs. Patterson from next door pressed her face against the window. Her reading glasses perched on her nose. The lace curtains parted wider as she craned to see better. Across the street, Mr. Chen opened his front door and stepped onto his doorstep, his house slippers scraping against the threshold. Down the road, curtains twitched in windows. The Johnsons' teenage son appeared at an upstairs window, mobile phone in hand. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. This was her street, her home, her neighbors watching her family fall apart in full view. Everything felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's nightmare, like watching herself on television. Harold's face was pale as parchment. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The stubble on his chin looked darker against his white skin. His work badge, clipped to his shirt pocket, caught the light from the street lamp. "Eleanor, what are you doing? What's gotten into you? Don't you dare." Eleanor's voice came out as a growl she didn't recognize. "Don't you bloody dare play innocent with me." Her fingers tightened on his collar. She could feel his pulse through the fabric, rapid and panicked. Good. Let him be scared. Let him feel what Clara had been feeling. Clara looked up from the step. Her brown eyes were wide with terror, the pupils dilated with shock. But there was something else there, something Eleanor had never seen before. Relief? Gratitude? As if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. No cars passed down their quiet street. Even the evening birds seemed to have stopped singing. Only the distant hum of the chip shop fryer filled the air, along with the faint sound of a television from the house next door. Someone was watching the evening news. Eleanor's hands began to shake with the aftermath of adrenaline. What had she done? What had she seen? The fragments of memory felt sharp and confusing, like pieces of broken glass cutting into her consciousness. Harold coming out of Clara's room. The door clicking shut behind him. Clara's muffled sob from inside. The sound of fabric tearing. Eleanor climbing the stairs, her slippers silent on the worn carpet. The bedroom door left ajar. Clara sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands, her blouse hanging open. The rage had been instant, primal. Before Eleanor could think or question or doubt, she had lunged at Harold in the hallway, grabbed him, dragged him downstairs and out onto the front step, where the whole world could see what kind of man he really was. "Someone call the police," Mrs. Patterson shouted from her window, her voice shrill with excitement and horror. "Call 999. No." Clara's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the evening air like a blade. "Please, no police." Eleanor felt her world tilting sideways. 3 months ago, everything had been normal, ordinary, safe. She had trusted Harold with her home, her family, her daughter-in-law. She had welcomed him into their lives, grateful for his steady presence after so many years alone. Now she stood in her own front garden, gripping her husband's shirt, wondering if she really knew him at all. Wondering what else she had missed. What other signs she had ignored. The chip shop bell chimed as another customer entered, the sound bright and cheerful in the gathering dusk. Life continued around them, normal and unchanged. Children played in back gardens. Families sat down to their evening meals. The world kept spinning. But on Maple Street, something had broken that could never be fixed. Harold tried to straighten his shirt, his hands trembling. Eleanor, you've got this all wrong. I can explain. Explain what? Eleanor's voice was ice cold now, each word precise and cutting. Explain why Clara's blouse is torn. Explain why she's bleeding. Explain what you were doing in her room. The questions hung in the air like accusations. Eleanor could see the answers in Harold's face, in the way his eyes darted away from hers, in the guilty slump of his shoulders. She had married a monster. Brought him into her home. Given him access to Clara. Sweet, vulnerable Clara who had already lost so much. The weight of her mistake settled on Eleanor's shoulders like a lead blanket. How long had this been going on? How many nights had Harold crept to Clara's room, while Eleanor slept soundly beside him? How many times had Clara suffered in silence? Too frightened or ashamed to speak? Get out, Eleanor said quietly. Get out of my house. Get out of my life. Harold's face crumpled. Ellie, please, let me explain. It's not what you think. But Eleanor was already turning away from him, moving toward Clara on the step. Her daughter-in-law looked so small, so fragile. Like a child who had been hurt beyond comprehension. Come on, love, Eleanor said. Softly, wrapping her cardigan around Clara's shoulders. Let's get you inside. Let's get you cleaned up. As they walked toward the front door, Eleanor heard Harold's footsteps retreating down the path. The gate creaked open and slammed shut. His taxi engine started with a reluctant cough. The neighbors were still watching. Still whispering. Tomorrow, the whole street would be talking about what they had witnessed. But Eleanor didn't care anymore about appearances or reputation. Or what people might think. She cared about Clara. About making her safe. About protecting what remained of their shattered family. The front door closed behind them with a soft click, shutting out the watching eyes and whispered judgments of Maple Street. 3 months earlier, Eleanor had been content. Genuinely, peacefully content for the first time in years. The kind of contentment that comes after grief. Has settled into something manageable. When the sharp edges of loss have worn smooth and life begins to feel possible again. She would wake at 6:30 to the sound of Harold starting the taxi engine in their narrow driveway. The old Ford Granada coughed and wheezed in the morning cold. But it was reliable enough. Harold always left her a cup of tea, cooling on the bedside table before his early shift. Milk, 1 sugar, in the blue-striped mug. Her first husband James had bought her on their honeymoon in Blackpool. The way James used to make it, before the heart attack took him suddenly. One rainy Tuesday morning 5 years ago. Harold was different from James in every way that mattered. Where James had been impulsive and romantic, Harold was steady and practical. James brought her flowers for no reason and forgot to pay the electric bill. Harold fixed leaky taps without being asked and remembered to buy bread on his way home from work. He never forgot anniversaries or birthdays. But he marked them with useful gifts. A new iron, a warm winter coat, sensible shoes. After 5 years of marriage, Eleanor had stopped expecting grand gestures. Small kindnesses were enough. A cup of tea in the morning. A newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle. The bins put out on collection day without being reminded. Clara would appear in the kitchen by 7 each morning, already dressed for the flower shop in neat skirts and cardigans. Her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She moved quietly around the small kitchen, careful not to wake Leo, who was always reluctant to get up for school. Always neat, always smiling, always grateful. Morning, Eleanor. Sleep well? I've put the kettle on. Eleanor lived for these moments. The kitchen filled with gentle morning light, filtering through yellow gingham curtains. The kettle whistling on the gas hob. Clara buttering Leo's toast soldiers, while humming something soft and tuneless under her breath. The radio playing quietly in the background. Local news mixed with golden oldies. It felt like having a daughter again. Like being needed and useful. And part of something larger than her own small existence. Clara had moved in after the accident, when grief was still raw and shocking. Her husband, Eleanor's only son Michael, had been fixing a customer's roof when the latter slipped on wet tiles. Gone at 28, leaving behind a 6-year-old boy with his father's stubborn chin and a wife who looked lost and hollow-eyed at the funeral. "You don't have to stay," Eleanor had told her at the graveside, watching as they lowered Michael's coffin into the dark earth. "I know this house holds painful memories." But Clara had gripped her hand with surprising strength, her wedding ring loose on her finger. From the weight she had lost in those awful weeks after the accident, it holds good memories too. Michael was happy here. And Leo needs his grandmother. "I need you too, Eleanor. We're family now. All the family either of us has left." So they had built a routine together. The three of them learning to live around the Michael-shaped hole in their lives. Eleanor would walk Leo to St. Margaret's Primary each morning, his small hand warm in hers. His school bag bouncing against his back as he chattered about playground, politics and reading levels. Clara managed the flower shop they had opened together with Michael's life insurance money, a small storefront on Church Street. With a cheerful yellow awning and window boxes full of seasonal blooms, Harold worked his taxi shifts, bringing home stories of drunk university students who couldn't remember their addresses and elderly ladies with too many shopping bags and cats that needed collecting from the veterinary surgery. He was patient with difficult passengers, Eleanor had noticed, kind to the confused and the lonely. It was one of the things that had drawn her to him. In the first place, that fundamental decency. Evenings meant proper home-cooked meals around the kitchen table. Shepherd's pie with creamy mashed potatoes and frozen peas. Bangers and mash with onion gravy. Fish on Fridays, usually cod from the chip shop or salmon fish cakes. If Eleanor felt ambitious, Clara always insisted on cooking, standing at the Formica counter in her apron, adding her own touches to Eleanor's tried and tested recipes. A bit more rosemary in the roast potatoes. Fresh mint from their back garden stirred into the peas. Brown sauce instead of tomato ketchup for Harold, who had northern tastes. After dinner, they would settle in the sitting room to watch television. Harold dozed in his worn leather armchair, his reading glasses perched on his nose, the evening news folded across his chest. Leo sprawled on the carpet with his homework spread around him like battlefield debris, chewing his pencil and asking for help with long division. Clara sat beside Eleanor on the floral sofa, mending Leo's school jumpers with precise, careful stitches, or reading women's magazines borrowed from the shop. "Look at this," Clara would say, pointing to some celebrity gossip about footballers' wives or soap opera stars. "Can you imagine living like that? All those photographers following you about?" Eleanor couldn't imagine it. She preferred their small, predictable world. The corner shop where Mrs. Ahmed always asked after Leo's progress at school, and saved the last packet of his favorite biscuits. The Queen's Head pub where Harold played darts on Thursday nights with other taxi drivers, nursing half pints of bitter and complaining about traffic wardens. The parish church of St. Matthew's where they attended Sunday service. Sitting in the same wooden pew Michael had fidgeted in as a restless child, his school shoes scuffing against the hassocks. On Saturdays, they would visit Michael's grave together. The 3 generations of their diminished family. Clara brought fresh flowers from the shop. Usually white lilies because they had been Michael's favorite. The ones he used to steal from Eleanor's garden to give to his primary school crushes. Eleanor would tidy the granite headstone with a damp cloth, pulling weeds from the plot and straightening the small solar light they had installed so the grave wouldn't be dark during the winter months. Leo would chatter about school football matches and playground dramas, his voice bright and unconsciously cheerful in the quiet cemetery. Eleanor found comfort in his innocence, in the way children adapt to loss and carry on, living within resilience adults can only envy. It was a good life, Eleanor thought during those peaceful months. Not exciting, perhaps. Not the life she had imagined for herself as a young woman, dreaming of adventure and romance. But warm, comfortable, predictable, safe. She had Harold's steady presence, Clara's gentle company, Leo's laughter echoing through the house. The flower shop was doing well enough to pay the bills and provide a small income. Eleanor's pension from the NHS covered the mortgage and household expenses. They weren't rich, but they had enough. For the first time since James's death, Eleanor felt like she belonged somewhere again. Like she had a purpose beyond simply existing from day to day. She was a wife, a grandmother, a mother-in-law. She was needed. She should have known it was too good to last. In Eleanor's experience, happiness was always temporary, always borrowed against future sorrow. But for those 3 perfect months, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps she had finally found her place in the world again. Perhaps she had earned some peace after all the grief and loss. Perhaps this quiet suburban life was enough. Perhaps she could stop waiting for the other shoe to drop and simply enjoy what she had been given. She was wrong, of course. She had been catastrophically, dangerously wrong about everything. The changes started so small that Eleanor almost missed them. A shadow passing across Clara's face when she thought no one was looking. A hesitation before answering simple questions. The way she began pushing food around her plate instead of eating. At first, Eleanor attributed it to the approaching anniversary of Michael's death. Grief had its own calendar, its own seasons of remembrance and pain. But this felt different, sharper, more immediate. Clara started picking at her breakfast, leaving most of her toast uneaten. She would excuse herself from Sunday lunch to lie down upstairs, claiming headaches that seemed to last for hours. When Eleanor knocked softly on her bedroom door, Clara would call out that she was fine, just tired, but her voice sounded strained and false. Just the change of seasons. Clara would say when Eleanor pressed her about her loss of appetite. You know how the autumn affects some people. All that dampness and gray sky. But Eleanor had been a district nurse for 30 years before retirement. She knew the difference between seasonal melancholy and something deeper, more troubling. Clara's face had grown pale and drawn, her skin taking on a grayish quality that spoke of sleepless nights and constant stress. She had always been slender, but now her clothes hung loose on her frame. Her wedding ring slipped around on her finger when she gestured. And Eleanor noticed she had started wearing cardigans even on warm days, as if she couldn't get properly warm. The nightmares began in early October. Eleanor would wake in the darkness to muffled sounds from Clara's room across the landing. Soft whimpering, like an animal in pain. Sometimes words, indistinct but urgent. Please, no, don't do that. Eleanor would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her heart racing with the anxiety she couldn't name. Should she go to Clara? Wake her from whatever demons haunted her sleep? Harold slept soundly beside her, snoring softly, unaware of the distress just meters away. One night, Eleanor crept to Clara's door and listened, her bare feet silent on the worn carpet. Clara was talking in her sleep, her voice thick with fear and desperation. Stop it. Please stop it. I won't tell anyone. Just please stop. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Clara sounded like a child, terrified and pleading and utterly helpless. Eleanor's hand froze on the door handle, torn between the desire to comfort and the fear of intruding on something private and painful. What kind of dreams could produce such anguish? What memories was Clara reliving in the dark hours before dawn? The next morning, Eleanor tried to broach the subject over breakfast. Leo was upstairs getting dressed for school, and Harold had already left for his morning shift. It seemed like the perfect opportunity for a gentle conversation. You seemed restless last night, love. Bad dreams? Clara's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down too quickly. A splash of brown liquid stained the yellow tablecloth. Eleanor's mother had embroidered decades ago. I don't remember dreaming. Must have been something I ate. That Indian takeaway was a bit spicy. But her eyes darted away as she spoke, focusing on the window, the calendar on the wall, anywhere but Eleanor's concerned face. And Eleanor noticed something else that made her stomach clench with worry. Clara was wearing a high-necked jumper, despite the unseasonably warm October weather. When she reached for the marmalade jar, the wool sleeve rode up slightly, revealing what looked like finger-shaped bruises on her pale wrist. Dark purple marks against white skin, too precise to be accidental. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Clara, what happened to your arm? Clara yanked her sleeve down immediately, the gesture quick and panicked. Nothing serious. I banged it on the shop door yesterday. You know how heavy that old thing is. Always swinging shut when the wind catches it. The explanation sounded rehearsed, as if Clara had been practicing it. Eleanor wanted to pull up the sleeve, examine the marks more closely, but something in Clara's expression stopped her. There was fear there, but also a pleading that seemed to say, "Don't ask questions I can't answer." That evening, Eleanor cornered Harold in their bedroom, while he was getting ready for bed. The small room felt cramped with 2 people moving around, and Eleanor had to speak quietly to avoid being overheard. Something's wrong with Clara. She's losing weight, having nightmares. And I think someone's hurt her. Harold was unbuttoning his work shirt. The blue one with permanent ink stains on the pocket from leaking pens. His movements were methodical, unhurried. You're imagining things, Ellie. The girl's still grieving. It comes in waves, you know. Just when you think you're over it, something triggers the pain again. It's been nearly 2 years since Michael died. This is different. This is fear, Harold. I can see it in her eyes. Harold sighed, hanging his shirt on the back of the chair, where he had hung it every night for 5 years. His routine never varied. Look, she's a young woman living with her in-laws. Maybe she needs her independence. Her own flat. Some distance from all the memories. Eleanor felt a stab of panic at the thought. She can't leave. What about Leo? He's settled at school, has his friends. What about the flower shop? We're partners. The shop was your idea, remember? Your investment. Maybe it's time she found her own way in the world. Made a fresh start. But Eleanor couldn't accept that explanation. Clara wasn't restless or ambitious. She was scared. Genuinely, desperately frightened of something or someone. The bruises on her wrist weren't from a door. The nightmares weren't about grief. Someone was hurting her daughter-in-law. And Eleanor was the only one who seemed to notice or care. Over the following days, Eleanor watched Clara more carefully. She noticed how Clara checked the locks on doors and windows before bed, how she startled at unexpected sounds, how she avoided being alone in rooms with the curtains drawn. Classic signs of trauma, of someone living in constant fear of attack. But who was threatening her? And why wouldn't she ask for help? The questions consumed Eleanor's thoughts during the long October nights, listening to Harold's peaceful snoring while somewhere across the landing, Clara whimpered in her sleep, reliving whatever horror haunted her dreams. Eleanor had failed to protect her son from a tragic accident. She would not fail to protect Clara from whatever evil had entered their lives. But first, she needed to understand what they were facing. She needed answers, even if Clara wouldn't provide them willingly. Eleanor waited 3 days before calling Martin Doyle. 3 days of watching Clara grow thinner and more hollow-eyed, of lying awake, listening to muffled sobs from across the landing, of seeing Harold dismiss her concerns with increasing impatience. She found Martin's number in the yellow pages, tucked between private hospitals and property management. The advertisement was small and discreet, designed not to attract attention. Confidential inquiries, domestic matters a specialty, ex-metropolitan police, reasonable rates. Eleanor called from the phone box outside the post office, feeding coins into the slot while Mrs. Ahmed watched curiously from behind her shop counter. She felt foolish and slightly guilty. Like a character in one of the detective novels she borrowed from the library. Martin's voice was warm and reassuring over the crackling connection. Mrs. Briggs, how can I help you? I need to hire someone to investigate. To watch someone. My daughter-in-law. I think she's in danger. There was a pause. I see. Would you like to meet to discuss this properly? Somewhere private, where we can talk without interruption. They arranged to meet at a cafe near Manchester city centre. Away from Maple Street and curious neighbors. Eleanor told Harold she was visiting her sister in Stockport. A lie that sat heavily on her conscience but seemed necessary under the circumstances. Martin was smaller than Eleanor had expected, more like a bank manager than a private investigator. Mid-50s, with graying hair, combed neatly to one side and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a modest brown suit and carried a leather briefcase that had seen better days. Nothing about him suggested drama or danger, which Eleanor found oddly comforting. The cafe was nearly empty at 3 in the afternoon. Just a few pensioners nursing pots of tea and sharing slices of Victoria sponge. Eleanor chose a corner table away from the windows, feeling paranoid and slightly ridiculous. Tell me what's troubling you, Mrs. Briggs. Eleanor felt foolish explaining her suspicions to this quiet, professional man. Clara's weight loss seemed suddenly insignificant. The nightmares could be explained by grief or stress. The bruises might genuinely have been accidental. But Martin listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small spiral notebook with a fountain pen that scratched against the paper. His handwriting was neat and precise, like a teacher's. These behavioral changes you've described, he said when Eleanor finished speaking. When did they begin? About 6 weeks ago. Maybe 2 months. It's been gradual, but definite. Has Clara mentioned anyone bothering her? Following her? Any unwanted attention at work or elsewhere? Eleanor shook her head. She won't talk about it. Every time I try to ask, she shuts down. Says everything's fine, but I can see it isn't. I can see the fear in her eyes. Martin made another note. And your husband? What's his opinion on the situation? Eleanor hesitated, stirring her tea unnecessarily. Harold thinks I'm overreacting. Says Clara needs space, maybe her own place. He doesn't see what I see. Sometimes family members are the last to recognize when something is wrong, Martin said diplomatically. Or they prefer not to see it. Because acknowledgement would require difficult decisions. He quoted his rates with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. £50 a day plus reasonable expenses. Eleanor's pension wouldn't stretch far, but she had savings from her nursing years, money she had been keeping for emergencies or Leo's future education. This felt like both. I want to know who's hurting her, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. And I want it stopped. Whatever it costs. Martin spent 2 weeks following Clara's routine, with the methodical patience of someone accustomed to long surveillance jobs. His reports arrived by post each morning, typed on official letterhead and sealed in manila envelopes that Eleanor hid in her underwear drawer. The picture they painted was mundane and slightly heartbreaking. Clara left home at 8:15 each morning, walking to the flower shop via Meadow Lane and Church Street. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with other pedestrians. She spent her lunch hour alone in the small park behind St. Matthew's Church, usually with a sandwich she barely touched and a paperback novel she rarely seemed to read. Subject appears to prefer solitude, Martin wrote in his careful, objective style. She avoids unnecessary conversation with customers beyond basic pleasantries. Regarding their orders, several regular customers have commented that she seems distracted or not herself recently. Clara left the shop at 5:30 precisely, stopping at Tesco Metro for essential supplies. Milk, bread, something for Leo's packed lunch. She walked quickly, checking over her shoulder, frequently taking an indirect route home that avoided the darker, more isolated streets. No deviations from routine observed. No suspicious contacts or followers. However, subject displays classic signs of hypervigilance. She chooses seating with clear views of all approaches, avoids confined spaces, and demonstrates heightened startle responses to unexpected noises. Eleanor read each report carefully, looking for clues Martin might have missed. But Clara's life seemed blameless and solitary. She spoke to the postman, the shop suppliers, regular customers, ordering flowers for birthdays and anniversaries. Nothing threatening or inappropriate. But Martin's observations about Clara's behavior were troubling. She behaves like someone who expects trouble, he noted. Classic presentation of chronic anxiety disorder, possibly related to previous trauma or ongoing threats. On day 10, Martin's report mentioned someone new, a delivery man from the wholesale flower market, who supplied Clara's shop with roses, carnations, and seasonal blooms. Owen Harper, 28, single, clean driving record, no criminal history. Subject shows particular attention to your daughter-in-law, Martin wrote. Waits for her to check orders personally, rather than leaving deliveries with other staff. Lingers to make conversation. Yesterday observed offering to carry heavy boxes to her vehicle. Despite this being outside his normal duties, Eleanor felt a spike of protective anger reading this. Some man bothering Clara at work, taking advantage of her vulnerability and isolation. She could picture him clearly young, cocky, assuming that a pretty widow would be grateful for male attention. But Martin's next report was more complex and puzzling. Clara's response to Owen Harper is inconsistent. Sometimes she appears nervous in his presence, avoiding direct eye contact and cutting conversations short. Other times she laughs at his jokes and accepts his help with deliveries. She doesn't encourage his attention, but neither does she clearly discourage it. Eleanor frowned, reading this section twice. If Owen was making Clara uncomfortable, why didn't she simply tell him to leave her alone? Clara had never been shy about establishing boundaries with inappropriate customers. Martin had run a thorough background check on Owen Harper. No criminal record, not even a parking ticket. Previous employers described him as reliable, punctual, and well-liked by female colleagues. His references were glowing. If he's guilty of anything, it appears to be poor social boundaries rather than predatory behavior, Martin concluded. However, this doesn't explain the severity of Clara's symptoms or the timeline of their onset. Eleanor stared at the final report. frustrated and no closer to answers than when she had started. Clara was still having nightmares that left her sobbing in the darkness, still losing weight and jumping at shadows, still wearing long sleeves to hide whatever marks someone was leaving on her body. Someone was terrorizing her daughter-in-law. But it wasn't Owen Harper or any other obvious suspect. Which left Eleanor with a question that chilled her to the bone. If the threat wasn't coming from outside their small circle, where was it coming from? And why was Harold so determined to believe that nothing was wrong? Eleanor's suspicions about Owen Harper sharpened over the following week. She found excuses to visit the flower shop during delivery times, pretending to check inventory or help with the afternoon rush. What she observed made her increasingly uncomfortable. Owen was attractive in that careless way young men often are. Tall and lean with sandy hair that fell across his forehead. Bright blue eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He wore the standard green coveralls of Meadowbrook Wholesale, but somehow made them look almost fashionable. The other delivery drivers dropped their flowers and left. Owen lingered. Morning, Clara. Lovely day, isn't it? Though I suppose every day's lovely when you're surrounded by beautiful flowers. The compliment was harmless enough, but something in his tone made Eleanor's skin crawl. Too familiar, too intimate for a business relationship. Clara's response puzzled Eleanor even more. Sometimes she would freeze when Owen approached, her shoulders tensing visibly beneath her cardigan. She would sign for deliveries quickly, avoiding eye contact, her handwriting shaky on the clipboard. But other times she seemed almost relieved to see him, laughing nervously at his jokes and accepting his offers to rearrange the heavy buckets of gladioli. He seems nice enough, Eleanor commented carefully after one such visit, watching Clara sort through the morning's delivery of roses. Clara's hands stilled among the red petals. Owen? Yes, he's very helpful. Always willing to stay a bit longer if we need extra assistance. There was something in Clara's voice that Eleanor couldn't identify. Not quite fear, but not comfort either. Like someone walking on thin ice, never quite sure when it might crack beneath their feet. Eleanor decided to conduct her own investigation. She positioned herself in the cafe across the street during Owen's usual delivery time, nursing a cup of tea that grew cold, while she watched through the steamed-up window. Owen arrived at precisely 10:30 in the blue Meadowbrook van, backing carefully into the narrow loading bay behind Clara's shop. Eleanor watched him unload crates of flowers with practiced efficiency. But instead of leaving after Clara signed the delivery sheet, he stayed and stayed. Through the shop window, Eleanor could see them talking. Owen leaning against the counter, Clara arranging flowers with nervous, quick movements. He said something that made her laugh, but it seemed forced, brittle. When a customer entered, Owen stepped back politely, but he didn't leave. He waited until the customer had chosen a bouquet of carnations and departed, then resumed his position at the counter. Eleanor checked her watch. 20 minutes past his usual departure time. Finally, Clara walked him to the door. Owen said something Eleanor couldn't hear, and Clara nodded quickly. He touched her arm briefly, just a fleeting contact. And Clara pulled away as if she had been burned. Eleanor felt a surge of protective anger. The touching was inappropriate, unprofessional. Clara was clearly uncomfortable with Owen's attention, but seemed unable or unwilling to stop it. That evening, Eleanor cornered Clara in the kitchen, while Harold watched the news and Leo did homework upstairs. That delivery man, Owen. Does he always stay so long at the shop? Clara was washing up the dinner dishes, her movements mechanical and repetitive. Sometimes, if we're busy, he likes to make sure everything's sorted properly. He seems quite keen on you. Clara's hands stilled in the soapy water. He's just being friendly. Professional courtesy. But Eleanor had seen the way Owen looked at Clara. The way he found excuses to touch her arm or hand. That wasn't professional courtesy. That was a man pursuing a woman who might be too polite or too frightened to reject him clearly. If he's making you uncomfortable, love, you only have to say, I could have a word with his supervisor at Meadowbrook. No. Clara's response was sharp, almost panicked. Please don't do that. He hasn't done anything wrong. Really, he's just friendly. Eleanor studied Clara's profile as she scrubbed a plate that was already clean. The tension in her shoulders, the rapid movement of her hands, the way she avoided meeting Eleanor's eyes. This wasn't about Owen being friendly. This was about Clara being afraid of the consequences if his attention stopped. But afraid of what? Owen seemed harmless enough, if overly familiar. And according to Martin's background check, he had no history of aggressive behavior toward women. Unless Clara wasn't afraid of Owen himself, but of someone else's reaction to Owen's interest. Someone who might not appreciate another man paying attention to Clara. The thought sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. Was Clara protecting Owen from someone? Or was she protecting herself from someone who might punish her for encouraging male attention, however innocent? Clara, Eleanor said gently, if someone is making you feel like you can't make your own choices about who you talk to or spend time with, that's not right. You know that, don't you? Clara's hands trembled as she lifted the plate from the water. For a moment, Eleanor thought she might finally open up. Might trust Eleanor with whatever was terrorizing her. But the moment passed. Clara dried her hands on the tea towel and hung it neatly on the rail beside the sink. I'm fine, Eleanor. Just tired. I think I'll have an early night. She disappeared upstairs, leaving Eleanor alone with her growing certainty that Clara's fear had nothing to do with Owen Harper and everything to do with someone much closer to home. Someone who might be sitting in the next room, watching the evening news and planning his next move. The investigation stalled like a car on a cold morning, sputtering and refusing to start despite Eleanor's increasingly desperate attempts to find answers. Martin's reports grew shorter and less informative. Clara continued her routine of work, home, and silent suffering. Harold dismissed Eleanor's concerns with growing irritation. You're becoming obsessed, Ellie. It's not healthy. They were arguing in whispers in their bedroom, trying not to wake Leo or alert Clara to the tension between them. Harold sat on the edge of the bed in his pajamas, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he pretended to study the football scores in the evening news. I'm trying to help her. Someone is hurting our Clara, and you act like it's none of our business. Maybe it isn't our business. Maybe she's entitled to her privacy. Eleanor stared at her husband, searching his face for some sign of the man she thought she had married. Privacy? She's living under our roof, Harold. She's family. And she's clearly in distress. Harold folded the newspaper with sharp, precise movements. Have you considered that your constant questioning might be making things worse? That maybe she'd feel more comfortable talking to someone her own age? Someone who isn't watching her every move like a prison warden. The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. Eleanor had been watching Clara obsessively, looking for clues in every gesture, every expression. But what choice did she have when Clara refused to admit anything was wrong? I'm worried about her. I'm trying to protect her. From what? From whom? You've hired a private investigator to follow the poor girl around Manchester. And what has he found? Nothing. No threats, no stalkers, no dangerous ex-boyfriends. Maybe the problem isn't external, Ellie. Maybe Clara needs professional help. Counseling. Antidepressants. Eleanor felt a surge of frustrated fury. This isn't depression, Harold. I've seen depression. This is fear. Pure, constant fear. Someone is threatening her. Who? The delivery man? Your detective says he's harmless. The customers? They're mostly elderly ladies, buying flowers for their grandchildren. Face facts, Eleanor. There is no mysterious threat. Clara is struggling with grief and adjustment. And your paranoia is making it worse. Harold turned off the bedside lamp and settled under the covers, his back to Eleanor. Conversation over. Case closed. But Eleanor couldn't let it go. She lay in the darkness, listening to Harold's breathing deepen into sleep, and found herself analyzing his words. His tone, his certainty that there was no external threat to Clara. How could he be so sure? 3 doors down, Clara was having another nightmare. Eleanor could hear her voice through the thin walls, pleading and desperate. Please stop. I'm sorry. I won't do it again. Eleanor's heart clenched. What wouldn't Clara do again? Talk to Owen Harper? Accept help with the flower deliveries? Smile at a customer's joke? Or was it something else entirely? Something that happened in their own house, when Eleanor was asleep or out, shopping or walking Leo to school? The next morning, Eleanor watched Harold over breakfast. Really watched him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time in months. He ate his cornflakes methodically, reading the sports pages and commenting on Manchester United's transfer prospects. Normal, domestic, unremarkable. But when Clara entered the kitchen in her dressing gown to make Leo's packed lunch, Eleanor noticed something that made her stomach lurch. Harold's eyes followed Clara's movements around the small room. Not obviously, not in a way anyone else might notice. But Eleanor saw it. The way his gaze lingered on Clara's legs beneath the cotton robe, the slight smile that played around his lips when she bent to retrieve Leo's lunchbox from a low cupboard. "Morning, Clara. Sleep well?" Clara's response was barely audible. "Fine, thank you." She didn't meet Harold's eyes. Didn't meet anyone's eyes. She made Leo's sandwiches quickly. Her movements nervous and hurried, and disappeared back upstairs without her usual morning tea. Eleanor felt sick. Was she imagining things? Reading sinister motives into innocent behavior? Harold had always been appreciative of feminine beauty. James had been the same way, harmlessly admiring attractive women on television or in magazines. It didn't mean anything, did it? That afternoon, Eleanor found Clara weeping silently in the living room. She sat curled in the corner of the sofa, clutching Leo's old teddy bear to her chest like a lifeline. Her shoulders shook with suppressed sobs, and when she saw Eleanor, she quickly wiped her eyes and tried to smile. "Sorry, just feeling a bit emotional today." "Silly, really?" Eleanor sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to seem intrusive. "There's nothing silly about sadness, love. But this isn't just sadness, is it? This is something else." Clara's grip tightened on the teddy bear. For a long moment, Eleanor thought she might finally break down and confess whatever was tormenting her. But instead, Clara pulled herself together with visible effort. "I've been thinking about what Harold said. About getting my own place. Maybe it's time Leo and I found somewhere else to live." Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. "You can't leave. This is your home. Leo's home. We've imposed on your kindness long enough. You and Harold deserve your privacy." There it was again. Privacy. The same word Harold had used, as if they had discussed it together, as if Harold had been encouraging Clara to leave. "Clara, has someone asked you to leave? Suggested that you might be more comfortable elsewhere?" Clara's face went very still. "No one's asked me to leave. I just think it might be better for everyone if we had our own space." But Eleanor could see the lie in Clara's eyes, in the way she couldn't quite meet Eleanor's gaze. Someone had asked her to leave. Or threatened her. Or made it clear that her presence was no longer welcome. "If someone has made you feel unwelcome in this house, you need to tell me. This is your home, Clara. You have every right to be here. I know. You've been wonderful to us. More than wonderful. But sometimes it's better to make a fresh start." Eleanor wanted to shake her, to demand the truth, to refuse to let Clara disappear into whatever nightmare was consuming her. But something in Clara's posture, in the desperate way she clutched that teddy bear, told Eleanor that pushing too hard might shatter what little composure Clara had left. So Eleanor simply sat with her, offering silent comfort, and wondered how many more nights Clara would spend crying alone before someone finally heard her screams for help. Frustrated beyond endurance, Eleanor pressed Martin for a final consultation. They met again at the same cafe. But this time Eleanor felt the weight of failure settling on her shoulders like autumn fog. 3 weeks of surveillance had produced nothing but questions. Martin spread his final report across the small table between their teacups. Photographs of Clara walking to work, buying groceries, sitting alone in the park. To an outsider, they would look like pictures of an ordinary young woman living a quiet life. But Eleanor could see what Martin had documented. The hunched shoulders, the constant vigilance. The way Clara never seemed to relax completely even in supposedly safe spaces. "I've exhausted the obvious possibilities," Martin said quietly. "No stalkers, no threatening ex-partners. No workplace harassment beyond Owen Harper's rather clumsy attempts at friendship. Clara's life is remarkably isolated and routine. But she's terrified. You can see it in every photograph. I can see hypervigilance, yes. Classic signs of chronic stress and anxiety. But the source of that stress remains elusive." Eleanor stared at a photograph of Clara sitting on a park bench, her lunch untouched beside her, her eyes scanning the empty playground as if expecting danger to emerge from behind the swings. "There must be something we're missing. Some connection you haven't explored." Martin leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses to clean them thoughtfully. "Mrs. Briggs, in my experience, when we can't find an external threat despite thorough investigation, it's often because we're looking in the wrong direction entirely." "What do you mean?" "Sometimes the danger isn't coming from outside the victim's circle. Sometimes it's much closer to home." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, making it difficult to breathe properly. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if Clara is being threatened or coerced, and no external source can be identified, then the perpetrator might be someone with regular, unrestricted access to her, someone she can't simply avoid or report to authorities because of family obligations or economic dependence. Eleanor's coffee had gone cold, but she gripped the cup anyway, needing something solid to anchor her to reality. You think someone in our house is threatening Clara? I think it's a possibility worth considering. Domestic abuse often goes undetected because victims are economically or emotionally dependent on their abusers. They may feel they have nowhere to go, no one who would believe them, or that speaking out would make things worse. The logic was inescapable, but Eleanor's mind recoiled from its implications. Their house, their family, someone Clara trusted enough to live with, to share meals with, to care for Leo alongside. But who would? I mean, Leo is just a child. And I would never. Martin's expression was gentle but implacable. That leaves your husband, doesn't it? The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She actually recoiled, nearly knocking over her teacup. Harold? No. Absolutely not. He's a good man. Decent. He would never hurt Clara. Men who abuse women often appear decent to the outside world. They're frequently described by neighbors and colleagues as helpful, reliable, even charming. The abuse happens behind closed doors, in private moments, when there are no witnesses. Eleanor's hands began to shake. She thought of Harold's dismissive attitude toward her concerns, his insistence that Clara needed privacy, his suggestion that she find her own place, his certainty that there was no external threat. He married me. He knew Clara would be part of the package. Why would he agree to that if he intended to? Perhaps he didn't plan it initially. Perhaps the opportunity presented itself gradually. A vulnerable young widow, economically dependent, with nowhere else to go, no family to check on her welfare. It would be an abuser's ideal situation. Eleanor felt nauseous. The cafe seemed to be spinning slowly around her, the conversations at other tables fading to white noise. You're wrong. Harold isn't like that. He's never shown any sign of violence or aggression. Sexual abuse doesn't always involve physical violence, Mrs. Briggs. It can be coercive, manipulative. Threats about what might happen to Leo if Clara speaks out. Threats about making her homeless. Psychological pressure that leaves no visible bruises. The bruises on Clara's wrist. The torn blouse. The nightmares where she pleaded for someone to stop. Eleanor pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the floor. I need to go. This conversation is finished. Martin gathered his papers calmly. I understand this is difficult to accept. But consider this if I'm wrong. You've lost nothing by being vigilant about Clara's safety in your own home. If I'm right, and you do nothing, Clara's situation will only get worse. Eleanor left the cafe without saying goodbye, walking blindly through Manchester's crowded streets until she found herself outside Piccadilly Gardens, with no memory of how she had gotten there. The thought Martin had planted grew like a cancer in her mind. Harold, her husband, the man she shared a bed with every night, the man she had trusted with her home, her family, her most vulnerable daughter-in-law. Was it possible? Could she have been so blind, so trusting, that she had brought a predator into their lives? The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Harold's dismissal of her concerns, his eagerness for Clara to move out, the way his eyes followed Clara around their house, his access to Clara's bedroom when Eleanor was asleep or out of the house. But surely she would have noticed something. Some sign of inappropriate behavior. Some hint of the monster Martin was suggesting lurked beneath Harold's ordinary exterior. Unless she had been seeing the signs all along, and refusing to recognize them for what they were. Eleanor caught the bus home with a new kind of dread settling in her stomach. Tonight, she would watch Harold more carefully. Tonight, she would pay attention to things she had previously dismissed as imagination or coincidence. Tonight, she might discover that the greatest threat to Clara's safety was sleeping in the bed right next to her. Eleanor's surveillance of her own husband began that very evening. She moved through their familiar routines, with new eyes, cataloging every interaction between Harold and Clara. Every glance, every word that might carry hidden meaning. Harold arrived home at 6:15 from his afternoon taxi shift, hanging his jacket on the peg by the front door and washing his hands at the kitchen sink. Normal, domestic, unremarkable. Something smells good, he said, peering over Clara's shoulder. as she stirred a pot of bolognese sauce. "You've outdone yourself again." Clara tensed visibly when Harold moved close behind her. Eleanor saw it clearly now, the way Clara's shoulders drew up, the slight flinch when Harold's hand brushed her arm as he reached for a tea towel. "Just using up the mince from yesterday," Clara said quietly, not turning around. "Eleanor bought too much at the butcher's." Eleanor always was too generous for her own good. Harold's tone was affectionate, but something in it made Eleanor's skin crawl. "Good thing we have you to keep us organized." The possessive undertone was unmistakable once Eleanor knew to listen for it. "We have you," as if Clara belonged to them. As if she were property rather than family. During dinner, Eleanor watched Harold's behavior with growing horror. The way he complimented Clara's cooking just a bit too effusively. The way he asked about her day at the shop with what seemed like genuine interest, but might have been surveillance. The way he offered to help with the washing up, an offer Clara declined quickly, almost fearfully. "I can manage. You've been working all day." "So have you, love." "Fair's fair." But Clara was already gathering plates. Moving toward the sink with jerky, nervous movements. Harold watched her go with what Eleanor had previously interpreted as fondness, but now recognized as something much darker. After Leo went to bed, Eleanor excused herself to use the bathroom upstairs. Instead, she positioned herself on the landing, where she could observe the living room below through the banister railings. Harold and Clara sat at opposite ends of the sofa, watching a nature documentary about African wildlife. Normal enough, except that Clara perched on the very edge of her seat, as if ready to flee at any moment. When Harold shifted position, reaching for his cup of tea, Clara startled like a rabbit sensing a predator. "Relaxing evening," Harold commented during a commercial break. "Nice to have the house quiet." Clara nodded but didn't respond verbally. Eleanor noticed that Clara kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, her body language closed and defensive. "You seem tense lately," Harold continued conversationally. "Everything all right at the shop? No problems with difficult customers?" "Everything's fine." "Good. I worry about you sometimes, working alone all day. Young woman like you, on your own. You never know what sort of men might get ideas." The words sent ice through Eleanor's veins. Was Harold warning Clara about other men, while positioning himself as her protector? Classic abuser behavior. According to the articles Eleanor had read about domestic violence during her nursing career, Owen Harper seems harmless enough, Harold added casually. "Though he does seem quite taken with you." Clara's hands clenched in her lap. "He's just being friendly." "Is he? I've seen the way he looks at you when he makes deliveries. Might be worth discouraging that sort of attention. Men can get the wrong idea very easily." Eleanor felt sick. Harold was systematically isolating Clara, making her fearful of any male contact outside their house, while positioning himself as the only safe male in her life. "I should go to bed," Clara said suddenly, standing up. "Early start tomorrow." "Of course. Sleep well." Harold's good night seemed innocent enough. But Eleanor caught the way his eyes followed Clara as she climbed the stairs. Hungry. Calculating. The look of a predator watching prey. Eleanor waited 20 minutes before returning to the living room, where Harold was dozing in his chair with the television still playing. "Harold? Are you coming to bed?" He startled awake, blinking in the lamplight. "What time is it?" "Nearly 10. You'll get a crick in your neck sleeping in that chair." Harold hauled himself upright with a grunt. "Getting old, I suppose. Can't stay up like I used to." They climbed the stairs together, Harold's hand resting on Eleanor's lower back in a gesture that had once felt affectionate but now seemed performative. At the top of the landing, Harold paused outside the bathroom. "Just going to brush my teeth." "Go ahead and get ready for bed." Eleanor nodded and went into their bedroom. But instead of changing into her nightgown, she positioned herself beside the slightly open door where she could see the landing. Harold emerged from the bathroom and moved toward their bedroom. But instead of entering, he stopped outside Clara's door. Eleanor held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. Harold stood motionless for several long seconds, his head tilted as if listening. Then, very slowly, his hand moved toward Clara's door handle. Eleanor's vision tunneled. This was it. This was the moment when her worst fears would be confirmed or dismissed. If Harold entered Clara's room, if he truly was the monster Martin suspected. The door handle turned with a soft click. Eleanor exploded from their bedroom like a fury unleashed. "What are you doing?" Harold spun around, his face pale with shock and guilt. "Eleanor, I thought I heard." Clara seemed upset earlier. I was just checking. But Eleanor was already pushing past him, throwing open Clara's door. The room was dark, but she could hear Clara's rapid breathing, could sense her terror in the darkness. Clara? Are you all right? A rustling of bedsheets. Eleanor? What's happening? Eleanor fumbled for the light switch. When the overhead bulb flickered on, Clara was sitting up in bed, her nightgown pulled tight around her, her eyes wide with fear. But it was the state of Clara's clothing that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Her nightgown was torn at the shoulder. Scratches marked her collarbone. Her hair was disheveled, her lips swollen. My God, Eleanor whispered. Clara, what happened to you? Clara's eyes darted to Harold, who stood frozen in the doorway like a guilty schoolboy caught stealing sweets. I fell. Getting out of bed, caught my nightgown on the bed frame. The lie was transparent, pathetic. Eleanor turned slowly to face her husband, and in that moment, everything became crystal clear. The dismissive attitude, the insistence that Clara needed space, the certainty that there was no external threat. Because Harold was the threat. Get away from her, Eleanor said quietly. Eleanor, you don't understand. I was just. Get away from her. Eleanor's scream shattered the night silence. Doors opened along the landing. Leo appeared in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. Mrs. Patterson's house lights came on next door. Eleanor grabbed Harold by his pajama shirt and dragged him away from Clara's room, away from their daughter-in-law. Away from the daughter Eleanor had failed to protect. Monster, she whispered, and the word carried all her rage, all her guilt, all her determination to make this right. How could you do this to her? Harold's face crumpled with the knowledge that his secret was finally out. Eleanor, please, let me explain. But there was nothing to explain. Everything Eleanor needed to know was written in Clara's terrified face, in her torn nightgown, in the way she shrank back against the headboard, as if trying to disappear entirely. Eleanor had brought a wolf into their home. Had shared her bed with a predator who stalked their daughter-in-law in the darkness, while Eleanor slept peacefully beside him. The knowledge would destroy her. But first, she had to make sure Clara was safe. First, she had to make sure Harold could never hurt anyone ever again.